Right, so I'm going to say some things about you. So Penny graduated with a degree in English literature from Durham University in 2016 before studying an MA in creative producing at Mount View, which she completed in 2017. Since then, she's gone on to work at Celador in programming, production, and administration, and she's now on furlough from there as in her full-time role as administrator. At the same time as doing all of this, she's continued to develop shows as an independent producer, with her most recent sellout show, Jewel, at the Vault Festival earlier this year, winning a Show of the Week award, as well as garnering a huge critical response. People called it electric, powerhouse writing, and Lynn Gardner said it was a form of liberation, which is amazing.
I'd forgotten she'd said that.
You might know her from a recent stage feature in which she discussed her decision to donate her entire furlough salary to funds in support of freelance theatre makers, and she encouraged other furloughed staff to do the same. Or you might know her from her insanely well-crafted and thoughtful Twitter threads, which are in a league of their own. She's one of the few people I know who, when faced with circumstances that benefit her, she only becomes more resolved to use those circumstances to lift other people up and dismantle the systems that perpetuate those privileges. So thank you so much for chatting with me, Penny BABAKHANI.
Oh my God, well done.
Oh, thank you.
That was really, really, this is why you're so good at what you do, Kirsten.
I just like interesting, inspiring people, and you are one of those. So I mentioned a couple of things there that I think we should definitely talk about, particularly your journey from from, I suppose, Durham Student Theatre, where we met, into a creative producing course, and then into producing this amazing sort of juggernaut of a show at Vault Festival. What stands out on that journey to you?
It's really interesting. I think what definitely stands out to me is it's that it's been a process. It's been a process of finding my voice, and it's been a process that has always been supported and encouraged. So I don't think, at any point over the course of that journey was I advised against trying things? Was I advised against thinking more radically, thinking more progressively? It was always a really well supported and nurtured and resourced environment, which I think kind of played a huge role in allowing me to get to the point that I am, because very rarely was I battling a mentality of scarcity. When we were at Durham, like, the entire city was our playground. There were so many spaces to try things out in. There were so many different people to try things out with. Over the years that I was there, certainly because you graduated a few years before me, the university's administration only got more and more supportive of artistic pursuits of their students as like extracurriculars. And so I've always been extremely privileged in that sense, is that at no point was I in an environment where somebody said, we can't really do that, or we shouldn't be doing that, or we should be thinking smaller, or we should be thinking inside the box more. So I think that's always, that's the bit that, thinking back, has been the most consistent kind of through line, the whole thing.
And that sort of, I suppose that links up to what we've discussed before about having a sort of being lucky in having a position from which to observe other people doing stuff and observe the status quo as it is, and see how we want to participate in it, and not feeling like we don't belong. Like, it seems, at least from my experience, I've come into this industry not feeling like feeling like I sort of understand my position in it, and at least feeling like I have a sort of lookout,
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I always think it's always very funny because at Durham, like what they're used to doing, not what necessarily in the student theater world, but generally the university, they are used to kind of producing the leaders of the big consultancies and the financial companies and all, and they're used to like turning out lawyers, and so they instill you with that confidence. They
Mm,
instill you with that confidence to go out there and go and kind of go conquer
mm,
um, those fields and those sectors. But because there was always less of an obvious pathway for entering the creative industries. They couldn't kind of bolster that in the same way. But I feel like so many of us kind of left Durham with that confidence
mm.
of our peers who were like, yeah, absolutely, I can go get a nice gig at a consultancy somewhere. And that's totally normal. And then we came into the creative industries, and it's completely different rules. You're playing by a completely different set of rules. And so um, we were, I think, you know, I was lucky enough in that I was in many ways equipped with the tools to like observe for a bit
Yeah.
and to kind of really look at things from as many angles as I could. And so yeah, I definitely feel like kind of walked into the creative industries and kind of took one step through the door and went, wait.
And then the good
Like,
stuff started coming out.
definitely when you kind of take a moment to take a breather and go, is everything quite as it should be?
Yeah, was that something that you is that how you would describe your time at Mount View, a sort of period of being like, wait a second, like what do you remember of that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. I think back, one of the kind of the final assignments that we did as part of our master's program at Matthew was putting on a was producing a solo show. So we were given a very modest budget. I still look back at that sometimes and I'm like, that's how much we paid people? Okay, that's how much we paid people. Good to know. We could definitely do better on that front for sure, Matthew. But yeah, so that was the first opportunity that I was really given to like go and try my hand at producing something, and that was at the culmination of a year where I had the amazing kind of privilege of meeting loads of people who worked in the creative industries, who worked as producers, who worked in organizations and companies, and I got to kind of meet the whole spectrum, as it were. And consistently throughout the whole thing, I kept on kind of coming up against these what felt like metaphorical walls. Like there just seemed to be some kind of barrier between all these people who worked in the industry and who were coming in to speak to us as future producers and myself. And I could never quite put a finger on like what it was. For some time, I thought maybe it's because they're all British and I am not, and so they are speaking to a kind of very British sensibility, a very British identity.
Yeah.
And I felt like maybe that's it. Maybe it's a cultural divide. And it was the exact same feeling that I'd come up against during my bachelor's in English literature, of kind of constantly coming up against these ideas and these people and these speakers, and kind of being absolutely be able to see their perspective and value their perspective, but feel like there was a disconnect. And it was only towards the end of my MA, like literally within the last month, when we'd done all the theory, we'd done all the meet and greets, we'd written all the essays and all of that, and we were actually producing, we were actually putting a show on, that I finally began to find some of the tools with which to describe that disconnect, to actually try and really suss it out and see what it was. And it was really only towards the end when I came to the realization that wasn't so much a kind of a cultural divide that I was experiencing, but more it was a I don't want to call it a moral divide. I don't think it's that. I don't want to go around saying like people in this industry have bad ethics. It's definitely not
People are
that.
amoral.
No, but I
No.
think it was a disconnect in values. Is probably the best way of putting it. Is that they valued things that I didn't, and so it was only towards the very end of that year when I kind of I finally, the question that I had in my head of what is that disconnect was really starting to get defined, and it didn't actually, it didn't get properly defined for another like 3 years afterwards. But yeah, that was kind of when I was producing that show, that was very personal to me and was very connected to my identity, and didn't really play by the rules, even to the extent that like the assignment was to produce an hour-long show, and the show that I put on was 25 minutes because I was like, that's the story. I'm not gonna, this is the story that I wanted to tell, and that story can be told in the most honest and authentic way in 25 minutes. I don't need to pad it out more for the sake of a solo show is meant to be 16 minutes long. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't feel the need to pad it out for the sake of what I consider to be relatively arbitrary constraints that at the end of the day were meant to serve the academic side of things as opposed to serve the story. And so that was one of the very first instances while I was at Mountview when I came up against this question of like, do I do things for the sake of how they should be done, or do I do things for the sake of how people tell me they should be done, or do I do things for the sake of how I know they should be done instead?
Yeah.
But at the time, I didn't really know that was what I was doing.
Yeah. You were just sort of like instinctually feeling your way through it, being like, I think this might be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. It was 100% instinct, and that's definitely been the thing that's kind of guided me through the whole thing. I've had these incredibly supportive structures, but then I've also been quite lucky in that I do have these magical instincts that have kind of helped me forge my own kind of way through them.
Yeah. That reminds me of stuff you've said about drama school training, and how it sort of links back to that in how the form of the content, I suppose, the form of delivery really should serve the content itself, if that makes sense. Like I spend a lot of time thinking about how form should, like how different, particularly in drama, like how different forms serve different stories or different ideas. And I wonder whether you think maybe a kind of drama school training that follows that a bit more might produce more ethical graduates. I mean, I don't want to like, I'm not saying that the current system of training is unethical, but it also seems to be sort of broken. What do you think is a change that could be made there?
Yeah, because I don't know if it's broken, but I think it fits the wrong purpose. I think that's kind of how I would describe it. I have, over the kind of the many Zooms that I have kind of dipped into over lockdown, I've come across a lot of people in the creative industries who, like me, are kind of interested in the intersection of art and system change and climate change and social change. And this kind of refrain that I keep on hearing, it's the same kind of narrative, the kind of battling narratives that we seem to be putting forward to the government as like the case for supporting the arts, is that there were a lot of people who were really going for the line that said, we are a major economic player, you should invest in us because we give you a financial return on investment, whether that's literally in the form of the shows or all the hotels and restaurants and hospitality industry that bubbles, that is like the bubble that cocoons creative industries. And then there were all the other people who were saying, you know, we serve communities, we are a huge player in education environments, we are a huge player in social services, we help kind of bridge all of these gaps that exist within society and communities. And I see the same dilemma in drama schools, is that really, you know, there are all these conversations that are being had around the time that the kind of that the curriculum was being changed. And you know, whenever schools say that they're going to leave arts and drama and music off of their GCSE offerings or whatever, there's always this uproar, which is that no, actually, like, kids need these skills. Kids need these outlets for their mental health, to help them kind of supporting their well-being, but they also need these skills because they are useful life skills. And drama schools and drama school education has this weird, at least in the way that I've kind of come across it, has this very strange way of completely disregarding that.
Yeah.
So, you know, up until you graduate school, we get told, no, we need like arts education because it has all these societal benefits. And then as soon as you go into higher education, it's no, we need all these skills because what we need is more people who are trained to work in the creative industries. And I think anyone who works in the creative industries knows that that's not necessarily the case at the moment. At the moment, we don't have the infrastructure, the infrastructure to sustain all this talent in a meaningful way. We have an infrastructure that is, yes, absolutely able to make a lot of money for some people, but it's not a sustainable infrastructure. And so it's very strange that we have all these drama schools that are training all these people for what I kind of consider to be the wrong ultimate ends.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be training people so that they can go into the industry and try and become famous actors and make lots of money. We should be training people because the kind of skills that you learn through an arts education, through a drama school education, they are the kind of skills that you need to solve the climate crisis. You need communicators, you need facilitators, you need people who are able to bring a disparate group together, you need people who are creative problem solvers, you need creative thinkers, you need storytellers, you need imaginative people who are able to go into a rundown warehouse and tell these amazing stories of the life that we could be leading. None of those have anything to do with the narrative of the creative industries as we currently tell them. So yeah, I find that kind of very, I find that very strange that that's what we're doing at the moment.
Yeah.
Which is that we're training all these people for the wrong ultimate purposes. Like you should be able to go and get a drama school education because that's going to make you a better lawyer. You should be able to go and get a drama school education because that's going to help make you a better teacher. You should be able to go and get a drama school education because that will help you communicate your scientific research better. But we don't see that. We've gotten into the habit of completely separating out all of these industries and saying, no, you shouldn't be working together unless it's through consultants. Yeah, you can absolutely kind of hire RADA in business to come and give your corporate staff some training on how to be better communicators. But we don't want those well-rounded individuals all through society. We want them separated out in different industries and then parachute them in, give them a consulting fee and then parachute them out again. So, but they don't ever actually talk to each other and work with each other. And that's really what we need.
I suppose I wanted to link that idea of we're all sort of working towards a goal which is at cross purposes with our values, I guess. With regards to the current global pandemic, you brought this tweet to my attention from Tarek Iskander, which basically said, who is the artistic director and CEO of Battersea Arts Centre. And he tweeted something that said that he's made his peace, that the world that existed will be no more, and he can't keep grieving it forever, but that gives more space for new things now. Do you feel that you've made peace with the fact that the old world is no more? I mean, I would imagine you probably have. You're quite like forward thinking and iconoclastic, which is what I love about you. In terms of developing more sustainable practice, what are the big things that we need to focus on eliminating?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was, again, we're talking, going back to the very beginnings of this conversation where I was talking about kind of supportive infrastructure and the infrastructure that's helped me grow and become the kind of producer that I am now. I was really fortunate in that, working a full-time job at Celador meant that relatively rarely for somebody in the creative industries, I had structure and I had kind of a 9 to 5, and some of the tasks that I was doing were to some end relatively repetitive, and it meant that, the more used I got to doing that and the better I got at doing that, the more kind of brain space, kind of latent brain space and conscious brain space it opened up for my brain. If you're sitting at your desk and for your mind to just wander off and think about different things. And so over the kind of 2 years that I was doing that, my brain started, the more I witnessed our industry from the inside, and the more I kind of really got an idea of our practices and how we do things and why we do things. I again came up with that same thing that I came up with during my time at Matview, where I went, okay, so we do things this way right now because that's how we're told to do them, but is that necessarily how we should be doing them? And yeah, I started asking that same question working at Celador, and so as a result of that, I kind of started paying a little bit more attention to conversations around climate activism and the climate crisis that were definitely not happening within the creative industries, at least as I was experiencing them. They were happening very much outside. They were happening in my communities. They were happening in my neighborhood. They were happening among friends who would never go to the theater. And so I use the extra brain space that you can get working a relatively kind of stable 9 to 5 job to try and kind of rummage around a little bit more there. And so kind of around halfway through last year, 2018, I think it must have been 2018.
Time is a flat circle at this point. I'm surprised that you can even
2018, that is stressful to think about.
That's a while ago.
Was it real? Okay, anyway, the more I think about it, the more I forget. July of either last year or the year before.
Yeah.
One of those two. I feel like maybe it was the year before. I started actually really kind of getting involved in climate activism, and so reading more and learning more and participating more. And it was through that, it was kind of through stepping outside of what I'd known, which for, even before Durham, I was a theater kid at school. I was part of that lot. I have been kind of submersed in this world as early on as kindergarten, and I'm one of those people who I'd never imagined really doing anything else or going anywhere else. And so, but especially when I went to university and when you go to Durham and you come across this amazing landscape of theater and theater companies and plays everywhere, I just kind of dove right in, and I kind of siloed myself off and went, I'm the theater person now. I only think and do theater things. It was only through the process of stepping outside of that and going, I'm gonna continue being a theater person, between 9 to 5, but I actually stopped attending the theater. I stopped seeing a lot of shows when I started working in theater full time, and instead I used my evenings and weekends and stuff to really get stuck in with the kind of climate activist community that was popping up around me. And once I'd done that, that was really when I started to find my words. And also the kind of the words that that was when I really started finding the answers to the questions that I'd been thinking of over the course of my MA in Mount View and kind of further on. That's where I found the answers. And so I found the answers, and I found the answers, and I also found peace. The kind of the peace that Tarek was talking about in his tweet, I think. I found that peace, luckily, pre-pandemic, outside of a theatrical context, knowing that when you're able to kind of look at the big picture, when you're able to really zoom out and see this for the kind of the global crisis, the planetary crisis that it is, theater doesn't seem as big a deal anymore. You kind of realize that the creative industries are just a puzzle piece. So instead of it being my be all and end all, instead of it being the kind of the sun that I like orbited around, it became part of a much bigger picture. And so I managed to kind of step out of our creative industries world, really engage with what was happening around me that I wasn't paying attention to because I was so busy thinking about getting amazing, talented dancers in glitzy costumes on a stage touring around the world. I really managed to kind of find some peace and find some answers, and then to come back into the creative industries with them. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it's this, I don't know how this is going to sound, but I would kind of check in with my climate activist friends, or just generally my activist friends, and we would go, okay, in a way, this is going to sound really awful, in a way, it's kind of a relief that it's happened now. Because, you know, in climate circles, we're always looking towards that 2030 deadline. The IPCC report says we have 10 years and we have a 10-year window in which we've got a 50-50 chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial revolution times. And so, you know, I've been thinking like in 10-year terms. We've been every wildfire, every flood, every kind of mass displacement event in the global south, we'd look at that and go, there's more of that coming. There's more of that coming. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly it was kind of this really unsatisfying relief that we felt of, oh, maybe now the rest of the world will realize just how interconnected all these systems are, how interconnected all these industries are, how interconnected all our lives are. And so at the very beginning, it was like, okay, this is, and I used to reframe this for my theater and climate, the ones who like me, who kind of saddled both, who were like in the middle of that Venn diagram, to be like, imagine if like the SARS epidemics that happened a few years ago in Asia, they were like your like fringe, they were like you doing your show in like the Old Red Lion fringe levels. Pandemic is like, that's like your off West End. You've maybe moved to like Southern Playhouse. You know, it's definitely a step up. And then, but then the climate crisis, your like your West End transfer is still coming. I think about it in those terms of like, you know, we've had the global financial crash, and we've had kind of SARS epidemics and MERS and all of that. Those are, and so this is we're still in previews. We are still in previews, and there's still time to change things between now and the West End transfer, and we get to decide what goes on stage. That was a very long, convoluted way of coming back around to your question. But like we are crucially, and I think what's changed now that, you know, that I hadn't seen before is there is a realization, a kind of a cross-sector, cross-society realization, even if they don't describe it in like theater terms, that like we are in previews. These are the previews. And as you and I know, so much can change. Everybody in the creative industry knows, especially in theater, so much can change in 24 hours between like a dress run and your opening night.
Yeah.
And so what do we want to do about it? What do we actually want to change? What do we want to leave behind? And I think, you know, the kind of the headlines of what we need to leave behind are, we need to leave exploitation behind. Exploitation of people and resources, whether that is in theater or whether that is in like mining of resources, lithium batteries that we put in our electric cars, all of that needs to be left behind. We need to leave these kind of we need to leave this idea of isolationism behind. That you can just draw up your walls. I think a lot of people hopefully have realized that there's a difference between acting locally and acting in isolation. You can act locally but think internationally, or you can act in complete isolation. You can be protectionist, and that's not where we need to be, because protectionism isn't going to help us. I think we need to leave, and again, that applies to the creative industries. We can't continue thinking in these binaries of like commercial and subsidized, West End and fringe. We can't do that. We are all, so many people have said, ecology, ecosystem. We have a very interconnected ecology. Okay, that's great. It's great to put that argument forward when we want to talk about government funding, but we also need to recognize that within in our industry and within our practices and the way that we promote stories and promote people. And we also, I think, definitely need to leave behind this notion that profits are more important than people, because they are not. They are not, and they never will be. So yeah, I think those are kind of the three things that I think we need to do away with, and that applies just as much to theater, to the entirety of the creative industries, and to like the UK and the world. If we can really find ways of doing that, of dealing with those kind of three headline things across everything that we do, then I think those are like the notes. If I'm the producer, I'm sitting in the back of the stalls, I'm giving you notes.
Oh my God, you're taking this metaphor to new heights.
I'll be like, I think this is what we need. And you know, within that, if you think about that, then immediately as well, you should start tackling the day-to-day manifestations of what those problems are, because those are quite system-based problems. Those are operational problems, but then the manifestations of that in our day-to-day lives, they look like racism, they look like misogyny, they look like ableism. That's what we experience. But those are the kind of the systems that underroot it: profits for people, isolationism and protectionism, and so that's kind of it's to keep that in mind as well. Is to always think beyond what is happening on our stages, and that's part of what we tried to do with Dual, was to go, we're telling a very specific story, but this specific story exists within a context. So how do we always make sure that that context is in the room? How do we give ourselves permission to tell our very specific story whilst also reminding the audience and ourselves throughout that the story didn't happen in silo? It's a product of the world. It's a product of the world around it, of what came before, after, and what will come after it. So how do you deal with that as well?
Totally. Oh my God, you blew that question out of the water, mate. And you brought us onto Dual, which I really want to, I would love to talk about, and also to link with this idea of isolationism. No piece of art can possibly stand like without context. So how do you, but so many claim to, you know, and so many see themselves as doing that. So how do you, I mean, that must have been such a tricky like endeavor for you guys to pull off, of giving yourself permission to say, well, no, we want to tell this story that can be experienced in, you know, the bottom of Waterloo Station at a scrappy theatre festival, you know, a scrappy performance art festival, but which is also steeped in the history of the people who are telling it, and steeped in the like the circumstances of that moment.
It was really interesting actually with Dual, because so part of the question of like how do you tackle that challenge is that we said to we deliberately set out to put together a team who could speak to different aspects of that experience. So Jewel is, you know, kind of quite literally, it's about the experience of our brilliant writer performer Peyvan Sadeghian, who is I think her Twitter bio is like a British Persian Chinese Cockney mishmash. I think that's the description. So she has a really intricate personal history, and she wanted to tell, in some ways, she wanted to kind of tell and explore that personal history. But you know, that personal history, whether it's the diaspora experience, the immigrant experience, there are lots of people who have experiences that are adjacent to that and that kind of touch on it in some way. And so we could have absolutely for sure kind of put together a team that was entirely like British Iranian, or just Iranian diaspora in some way, and we would have told an amazing story that way for sure. But we kind of set out to broaden the context of the show, and to kind of try and get across that it wasn't just a question of like Britain and Iran and migration and the diaspora. It's a question about kind of anyone. That Jewel is just one iteration of a much bigger story about kind of uncertainty and belonging. And so, you know, we have our amazing video and lighting designer, Al Orange, British, but lives in Spain. We have our director, Anastasia Somers, is Polish, but works in Britain, lives and works in Britain. So it was, and that's kind of our team. Our stage manager is originally Greek, but grew up here. And so that way, that was kind of us quite literally, quite practically trying to embody that question of how do you address the bigger context, the larger context, while also telling this really specific story. And I think so much of what I've realized, particularly over the process of working on Jewel, is that the best way, the absolute best way to kind of try and tackle these big questions is to practice, is to just try and practice them in real life. You know, we spend so much of our time in rehearsal rooms. We try things out. The best kind of rehearsal rooms are the ones where you are told you can try anything out, because we're playing, we're experimenting, and it's only through the process of feeling safe enough to practice and to try that you're actually gonna get at the right answer for your show. And so that's kind of what we did. We said, you know, we have big questions, we have big existential questions. how do you go about answering big existential questions? As you bring it into the room with you. We physically brought it into the room with us. We brought in people who, we brought in creatives who could tell you absolutely nothing about Iran, but who had their own language, whether that's, a literal like French, Dutch, Greek, a literal language, but also a creative language, a practical language with which to express questions, to express and kind of examine questions of home and belonging and diaspora and all of that. And so what we also did, what we tried to do was we tried to not privilege any language or form of expression above another, which for me as a producer was so fun.
Yeah.
I've been quite used to at Durham, but also at Celador, as you go to the licensors and you pick up the license to a show that already exists.
Yeah.
And the work is about taking the written word and building a creative team around it, and then kind of showing off our interpretation of that text. And with Jewel, it was completely different because Payvand especially was really adamant that this wasn't about her, and it certainly wasn't about her words alone. It was equally about the visual language, the sonic language, the kind of tactile language that Izzy, our set and costume designer, brought in. It was about all of those. And so every member of the creative team, and they were really a creative team, and part of, it was so great watching this in action. Nastasia, our director's job was less to sit at the helm and go, this is my vision, off you go and realize it, but to go, I am here to help facilitate a coming together of the lighting designer's vision, the composer's kind of vision. I'm here to facilitate the coming together of all these different contributions, of all these different languages. And so I think that was extremely liberating. It was terrifying because I was putting in a Vault application and writing marketing copy and designing a post that I still to this day. We had an amazing poster designer based in Edinburgh called Laura Whitehouse. And I remember the first email I sent to her, I was like, hi, Laura. I need artwork for a show that does not exist and will not exist for another 6 months. And I kind of vaguely know what I don't want it to be, but because I don't have a show, I don't know what I want it to be either.
I'll just
brief.
You just like point at posters, be like, not that, not that.
I sent her posters and I was like, I don't want any of this. But I also don't know what I do want because I don't have anything yet. Payvand had done she'd done a 20-minute scratch at Camden People's Theatre about 6 months I came on board, and that was it. That was all of the show that existed. And what was really satisfying about this process ultimately was that we were sitting there in tech, and Al, our lighting designer, was just kind of having a play around with options, and I look up, and the kind of the color palette that Laura had, or the poster designer, the artwork designer, had just kind of been like, she just randomly come up with on her own in her room in Edinburgh without having spoken to anybody else, having just seen some photos and some really early footage. I look up and like that color scheme was there in front of me, and I nearly passed out. It was such an amazing moment. But that's kind of how. But that was amazing. It could only happen because we made a deliberate point of saying no language, no creative, practical language matters more than any other in this space.
Yeah,
we could have easily called Roshi, our composer, a music director. We could have easily called Izzy the like creative director in terms of like creative set design director. We could have easily called Al the video director. Like they really, you know, they had agency to come and build this together, and that's what we did. We went into that rehearsal room, all of us together, and we built everything from the ground up. So that, you know, there are moments of text that exist because they were inspired by something that somebody else said in the room. There are moments of visuals that exist because of music that we were composing in the room. It all came together so kind of beautifully, but also it was deliberate. And it took practice and it took rehearsal, not in the sense that I think, you know, we've come to understand rehearsal of off you go, learn these lines, learn these steps, come and do them again and again and then again and again and again until they are no perfect.
Yeah.
The rehearsal was, how do you work together? How do you bring these languages together? And I think, you know, we were quite fortunate. I mean, it was hard work, but we were also quite fortunate that it did. It was a kind of the meeting of minds that you hope for whenever you build a creative team. That was definitely it.
Yeah, and I mean, that, like, you're also gambling on people coming into something like that and being willing to accept that sort of that approach and that way of relating languages to each other. And I wasn't able to see it, but it sounds like that was completely evident in the final product. I saw something that was like, this show has the most well integrated design of anything I've ever seen at Vault, because all of those languages were working together and we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, and it wasn't about integrating design at all. It was about going, this show is design. This show is this, like, you know, you could, and what's great now about the show is that you could take any one of those elements out and it just completely wouldn't work. So you know, like it's or you could, you know, you could, for whatever reason, bring in a new creative on board and the show would completely radically change, because the fingerprints of the people who worked on this original iteration, like down to our brilliant, amazing stage manager, who was essentially a second character, operating the absolute like whirlwind of sound and projection and light. She was essentially Pavan's co-star in that show. I remember kind of early days, the BC times, when I was talking to a venue about kind of potentially touring the show. They were like, "Oh, we can provide our own op," and I'm like, "No, you can't."
Amazing.
When you fill in the sheets and they're like, "How many performers?" I'm like, "Well, technically one, but two."
That's kind of great. That's so great.
Yeah.
I want to quickly talk about, I want to go back to this idea of being a kind of cultural outsider, and almost to that not necessarily to that moment at Mount View when you were wondering, is this sort of a British sensibility that I'm not getting, or that I can't relate to, because that's something that continues to I continue to think about and try and understand the meaning of in my work as well. You seem to have a really great attitude towards the fact that there is no escaping the cultural influence or the inheritance of this tiny island, and not necessarily, it's not even necessarily just about this place, it's sort of about the fact that there's no escaping any sort of cultural inheritance that we have.
Yeah, it's, I think about, I looked this up the other day, and there is no conclusive answer, but like, think of all the countries that Britain's invaded or colonized. It's, it's more than half the world, right?
Yeah.
And so in a very physical sense, like, Britain has kind of left bits of itself all around the world. So there's that aspect of it, and then there is also the aspect of this soft power that we hear kind of politicians talk about when they turn around and say, "Oh yes, we are going to save the creative industries because they are a massive weapon of soft power." And we kind of have to be conscious of the fact that that is to an extent how we are viewed. That is to an extent how any cultural output is viewed by the country that it's made in. It's a soft power. Like, I think about even as early as like in all the various places that I've lived leading up to moving to the UK. When I lived in Iran, I remember watching a dubbed version of the original BBC adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on TV. When I lived in Dubai, not only did I attend British kind of systems schools there, but also during our lunch breaks, when it was like 38 degrees outside and it was too hot to go and play, our teacher would put on episodes of Doctor Who for us to watch. When I was living here, growing up in Germany, we would take our drama classes, our theater class would take trips to the local cinema, and we would watch anti-live screenings. So, like,
Whoa, wow,
yeah,
that's full circle.
It's absolutely, from that aspect, it's been full circle, but also from like, even like before I was born, and obviously this will be different for every person, but even before I was born, there is a long history of British interference in the affairs of Iran and the Iranian government. The MI5 got together with what we now know as BP, previously British Petroleum, and they instigated a coup to oust Iran's last democratically elected prime minister. After that, you have years of British intervention in the Middle East that's served to destabilize the region. And so whatever angle I come at it from, whether it's political, economical, military, culturally, I've like my history and my upbringing have been intertwined with that of Britain. Like, I haven't really been able to escape it. And I think the example that I said to you was like, I remember as a kid looking in like books and stuff and reading about Greenwich Mean Time. How is like the world's system of time? Like, how do we understand time zones, etc.? And I remember reading that like somewhere in the world there is this place called Greenwich, and there is a line that runs through Greenwich, and based on your distance from that line, that is how your time zones are determined. I was like, I must have been like 8, 9 when I read this. And like, fast forward some 18 years later, and the cellular offices are about a 15-minute bus ride from Greenwich Observatory. And so, I kind of think like there's been a sense of inevitability to me getting here and working in these industries that I feel for myself. And not everybody might feel that. People will have very different relationships with their current situation. But for me, it's always felt like I was meant to end up here some way or another. And so I don't view myself. I view myself as an outsider, but I view myself as an outsider who is entitled to be here. Here metaphorically, because I'm technically in Germany at the moment.
Yeah, in rural Germany.
Yeah, I'm entitled to be here because because British history is also my inheritance. You know, like there's British history kind of written all over my upbringing, and so I'm like, I am equally entitled to come here and to try and make the changes that I think are necessary. I'm as equally entitled to make them in London in the theater sector as I am to make them in Germany or back in Iran, or even possibly kind of more entitled to do them where my shipping address is and where like I pay my taxes. Like that's where I am. And so I view my outsider status kind of less as a here's a complete outside perspective that you might not have thought of, but rather like, here is a perspective about yourself. Here is a perspective about Britain. Here is a perspective about your own country that you wouldn't know, that you haven't been taught to know, that I can offer you, because your history and my history are so endlessly intertwined. And I think, you know, depending on how deep you want to dig into it, it's the same thing if you are Australian, it's the same thing if you are a member of, you know, former colony, current Commonwealth. Yeah. Like you can probably, you know, even if you can't get your family back all the way to the origins of Australia, there is still the reason why Australia exists has something to do with Britain.
A lot, yeah, quite a lot, quite a big something.
Yeah, and so you it's like you might as well. It's like and I think it's about it goes back to that same question of changing assumptions about why things are the way things are, and also for me, part of it is also changing assumptions about what it means to be an outsider and what outsider status actually means when you consider the fact that Britain's fingerprints are all over the world.
What actually does outside mean when the influence is that large, you know?
Is so big. And I remember reading this article that said something along the line. It was very specific. It was talking about like foreign intervention in the Middle East, military intervention, etc. But it was saying that at some point, you know, we have to acknowledge that we are all connected. All our histories are connected. We live in a globalized world. There are very, very, very few indigenous communities that you can point to who live completely untouched by the rest of society. And so what precisely is the point? We shouldn't be touching those indigenous communities, leave them alone, should make that happen. But for everybody else, for those of us who kind of who live out and about in the world, what precisely is the point of isolationist, protectionist thinking when we know, like deep down, we know we are all connected? Same question goes to theater. What is the point of creating this drama school to West End to BBC pipeline when we know that so much of what we already do spills beyond the kind of the constraints of the theater sector, but should also spill beyond the constraints of the creative industries into wider society as a whole? Like what is the point of thinking you should only be receiving a drama school education for the sake of trying to make it in film or TV or theater, when we need these skills and we need these people and we need that care and passion in everything that we do? So yeah, I think that's always been my approach of going like, well, first of all, you know, fascism is rising all over the world. There aren't exactly that many places to go except New Zealand and Scotland.
And even you know, it's
even then there are always caveats.
Even then,
And so you're like, I might as well stay where I am. I might as well stay where I am because I'm entitled to be where I am, because I have something to say. I have something to speak to about the place that I currently am in, despite not necessarily having the right passport that would make you think, or having the right accent that would make you think, oh, she has a kind of a story about Britain worth telling. I do. I have a lot of stories about Britain worth telling. They might just not necessarily be wearing Union Jacks, but they are still stories about Britain. They just look and sound a little bit different than what you are used to.
So your Twitter is at Penny BABAKHANI with a K. Is there anything else that you would like to point people towards or plug?
I wasn't expecting a chance to plug things. No, I think let's not leave it at just plugging my Twitter. God no. Arts Emergency. That's what I'm gonna say. Arts Emergency is an amazing network that tries to recreate the kind of the old boys club that exists currently within the British private school education system, and kind of recreates the contacts that you make when you do the private schools and the Russell Group unis and the fancy entrances, but for people who don't have that. So they are really great. Even for like £5 a month, you can really help young people who don't necessarily think they have a place in the creative industries. And actually, they're the kind of people I found who would go get a creative industries education and then go and do something useful with it, as opposed to just make song and dance. So they're even better for it. That's what I'm doing. Arts Emergency. Arts
Emergency. Check them out. Great. Thank you so much again for this